Hey guys, I'm Jim. I edit photos. Thanks for stopping by. Today I'm taking a photo that I shot and processed 9 years ago as a 7 exposure HDR and re-editing one of the single exposures from that bracket set as a single exposure in Luminar. I was kind of playing around with the photo and I saw my original HDR, which is fairly colorful and kind of over the top. This is 9 years ago, so it was something I was really into, but I'm not as much into anymore. And I wanted to go take a look at that photo today, see what I would do differently. So I kind of wanted to do a comparison, see how things change. Here's the original 9-year-old HDR. So I did this in 2012, and it was basically a 7 exposure HDR. It's a sunset at Nashville, very colorful, very well lit, lots of things going on. So I thought what I would do is go into Luminar and edit the photo today. So here's a single exposure from that bracket set. And first thing I would do is go into Accent AI, and I just want to bump that up a little bit. Now I want to be careful, like on a photo like this, you could go to 100 and kind of get away with it, for lack of a better word, but I don't want to go that high. One of the things I think, it's hard to be objective about this, but I think that I've gotten a little bit better at controlling color and light in a photo now compared to how I used to be 9 years ago, right? So, the hope, of course, is that our skills improve and that sort of thing over time. I feel like mine have. We also, frankly, just have a lot better tools. Like, we just didn't have things like Luminar AI back then. And so this just gives me so much control and that sort of thing with the photo. So I'm making some basic adjustments here in the light tool. And whoops, not that much. I'm gonna do about a -30 on highlights, and I'm gonna bump shadows up about a 5 or so. So, so far I've done a little bit to the photo. There it is before, there it is after, a little bit better balance in the light, but there's still plenty of areas that need to be brightened. And I wanna add some detail or structure in certain areas. I wanna play with the colors a little bit. I do like to play with colors. That hasn't changed at all. I've always been a big fan of color. But the next thing I want to do is, as I'm focusing on the light, is go to super contrast, which is really just an amazing tool, and I find to be incredibly useful when I'm wanting to make adjustments to the light. So I'm coming down here and I'm kind of looking at my notes as well. So I did obviously experiment with this some to get it kind of just how I wanted to get it, before I started before I hit the record button, basically. But I also want to adjust the balance, and that's the big thing for me in super contrast. This tool is really good. I love it. So for highlights balance, actually before I click on that, let me just show you. There it is before anything with super contrast, and there it is after. So you can see it does help to kind of brighten some of those darker areas, but the balance sliders is really where, for me, a lot of the magic happens. And so I'm gonna go ahead and go to the right with the highlights balance. So if you look, if I go left, those highlights are getting a lot brighter and blown out, but if I go to the right, it's really taming them quite well. So I love that. I'm doing the opposite with midtones. I'm gonna go to a -42. That brightens those a little bit. And what I found here is on shadows balance, if you look at the foreground where there's a lot more shadow, as I go to the right, that's gonna get darker, of course, but as I go to the left, it's operating in such a way that it's really brightening that foreground area. So I ended up doing something about like that, which for me really helped balance out the light, which I love that about super contrast. So there it is before, and there it is after. The light is very much more balanced, and I think looks like a well done, even exposure in terms of the light itself. So super contrast, if you're not using it, make it a good friend, right? So after this, it's a sunset. I would immediately go to golden hour, and I'm gonna go pretty high here. I ended up going to about 80 actually. So that's kind of heavy-handed, but if you remember, let me go back and get the original. There's a lot of color going on there. Again, this was my heyday for HDR. So, I was 7 exposure HDR in Photomatix, and then I would do things in Color Effects Pro to amp up the colors. I loved doing that, and sometimes I still do, but I just don't do it the same way. But for me, very much like HDR looking. It's got that dark band of clouds at the top, and the colors are really just over the top. I don't want to have those dark bands of clouds. I want to have a bit more even distribution of light, that sort of thing. So anyway, I've done that with golden hour, which I think really helps pop those warmer tones. It's just fantastic, as you probably know if you have Luminar AI. But one thing that's bugging me, if you look at this original one, there's so much blue there, and it's just really too intense. So what I did is, I feel the same about this. Like, I don't want to oversell it. I don't want to just say, wow, look at my colorful photo. I want to make it a nice looking photo. So I go into the blue and I pull down the saturation like a negative 22, 23, something like that. I want the blue there. I love the contrast, if you will, between the warm tones of sunset and the clouds and that sort of thing, and the blue tones in the sky. But I don't want to overdo it. So I wanted to pull that saturation down a little bit. So there it is with the blue before the adjustment, and there it is after, a little bit tamer, a little bit more kind of just chill, right? So I'm now going to go into split toning, and in highlights, I'm going to take the saturation to like a 25, 26, something like that, 27. The hue I'm going to leave in the red, the farthest left, because I like that tone for this sunset. But if you look at the before, there it is. It's very golden because it was golden hour, sunset, that sort of thing. But I'm adding a little bit of that red to it simply because I just like it. That's a personal preference, but I use toning quite a bit on my sunsets with that kind of look simply because I like it, and I think it's just a great way to give it a little bit of bump. And the other nice thing is you can do something similar by going into the light tool and using the tint, which I used a little bit here, but that's global and that's going across the entire photo. Whereas when you're in toning here, because it isolates highlights and shadows and separates them, I'm just impacting the highlights. So it's really just hitting those like brighter parts of the photo, which I think looks nice. Now there's a couple of minor moves I want to do to kind of wrap this thing up. The first is here with a basic local mask. And what I want to do is go ahead and paint into the buildings. And what I want to do is just add a little bit more visibility into those. So let me go ahead and mask this, and then I'll show you the moves. Okay, so there's my mask. I just brushed it into those buildings, and all I want to do is create a little bit of warmth here. So I'm going to go ahead and move that warmth up just a little bit, so just like that. And I'm also going to brighten them slightly. I want to get a little bit better visibility, so maybe something about like that. And then, of course, I want to add some structure as well, which is going to give them just a tiny bit of crunch. And not a massive move. I don't want to overdo it. And so let me show you the before and after. There it is before I've done this adjustment. You can see a little bit darker, a little bit softer, really a little bit cooler. And then when I turn this back on, you can see they've gotten warmer, they've gotten brighter, they got a little bit more crunch. Although it's far enough away, you can't really probably see the crunch, but you can definitely tell that they're warmer and brighter. I think that that looks nice. And one more move to wrap this thing up. And if you look at the original again, one of the things I don't like about this, apart from the crazy over-the-top colors, is the foreground. It's just too bright. And I used to just go crazy with the HDR. And this honestly is kind of tame compared to a lot of my old HDRs. But the rocks are just not natural. I like having them there. I think it's a nice foreground element. I like how it kind of comes down, and then the riverbank, it kind of mirrors like the shape of the skyline a little bit. You can see much different kind of look here, but looking at those, I don't like that. I need to do a few things to them. So I've got this basic mask for the buildings, and now I'm going to add another basic mask, and this one's going to be done with a gradient mask, which is perfect when you're drawing like a big straight line, which is exactly what I'm doing here. So something about like that gradient, as you can see, is going to cover that area, maybe move that out just a tiny bit. And let me hide that mask again. But what I want to do here is I want to warm that up a little bit. So I'm going to do a similar warmth move, just mid-teens, kind of like I did on the buildings. I also want to brighten them a little bit. Something about like that. I don't want to overdo it. I don't want it to be like, hey, look how bright the rocks are, or, that sort of thing. But I just want to have a little bit brighter look. So I think I was at about an 18. I'm going to add a tiny bit of contrast. So maybe something about like that. I'm going to add some structure AI as well. I definitely want a little bit of crunch there. They're closer, and I feel like you would see that and notice that, so I'm trying to make it look real. And the last thing about it is that they're too saturated. And even though I warmed them up, they have a little bit of that kind of purple tint, but I don't want to go too warm because, when I get too far, like over here to the right with the warmth, which I'm dragging, it's going to just really get out of hand. So I'm going to leave that warmth at like 17, but they're too saturated, but I'm not going to use saturation. I'm actually going to use vibrance, and I'm going to go like a negative 20 on vibrance. And so what I want to do is not really get rid of the color, like reducing the saturation is going to pull down the amount of the color, and the vibrance is more like the intensity of it to me. And so I just want to pull down the intensity of that color a little bit. So I pulled that down to negative 20, but I left the saturation alone. And this local adjustment, there it is, the rocks beforehand, and there are the rocks now. So I think they look a lot more realistic. I think they go well with this scene overall. And if you look at the before and after, I mean, you know, we've come a long way, to be honest. Oops. I took some spots out prior to starting the video, but there it is before and there it is after. There are all these power lines, which frankly are kind of hard to remove. So I'm looking really forward to Luminar Neo, where it's going to have automatic power line removal, as you probably heard. So that's my edit. And I want to go back and compare it to see how things change. I mean, 9 years later, I think my style is different. In some ways it's the same, but there's definitely things I've done differently here. If you look at the clouds, for starters, like this big cloud over the over that kind of Batman-looking building, it's got way too much darkness in it, and now I've got a much lighter look. So to me, that looks less HDR, and the color intensity in the sky, especially the blue, is a lot more tamed. And also just all these darker clouds, all these other clouds, not including the big dark one, but like over here, they're just a lot lighter. And a lot of that is managing the contrast, which you can do so well with super contrast. So I feel like I've got a tamer, calmer, more realistic looking sunset compared to that. Now the buildings themselves, there they are in the before edit, and here they are now. Again, I think the color looks more reasonable. They're not quite as bright, and I just think overall, and I think that color tones look better. That one to me looks like it's a little too close to being kind of green, and over here I think it goes better with the overall sky. And then if you look at the bottom half of the picture, obviously the reflection is going to be different because the upper part of the photo is different. And so I think the reflection here has the same kind of problems that the reflection, or excuse me, that the sky has. Too intense of the color, too intense of the clouds, and just way too saturated in terms of like the intensity of that blue is just too much, and the yellow area over here is just too yellow and really over the top. I think here looks a lot more natural. There's a little kind of blown out area. I can hit the J key. Yeah, it literally actually is blown out. But honestly, things like that don't bother me like they used to. I think it looks natural, and I think it looks normal, and I think it looks fine. And then the rocks themselves, as I went through a moment ago, much different, and I think they fit the scene better, and I think it goes overall together. I think overall the edit, I like my current edit a lot better. I expect that we always would. I tend to edit some of my older photos from time to time just to see how things have changed. Sometimes they've changed a lot. Sometimes they haven't changed a lot, very much at all, but I still love color. I like the intensity of color, but my approach to color is different from the old days to the current days, and I think I've got a better, more realistic edit that still kind of satisfies my desire for, you know, nice distribution of light and also nice use of color. So that was it. I just kind of wanted to walk through a before and after, kind of like here's what I did 9 years ago and here's what I did today. And a lot of it's down to the tools. The other thing that's interesting is I used to take photos like this. I'd shoot 7 exposure HDRs and blend them because I had to. And in reality, I didn't have to. I got that out of a 7 exposure blend, and I got that, which I think looks nicer by today's eyes, if you will. It looks better, and that's a single exposure from that bracket set. So I used to always think that I needed HDR, and I probably didn't need it nearly as much as I used to think that I did. So it's kind of interesting how that has changed as well. That's it, my friends. Hope it gives you some ideas, maybe some tips, tricks, that sort of thing in editing your own photos in Luminar AI. Thanks for hanging out. I appreciate it. I'll see you real soon with another video. You guys take care of yourselves. I'll see you later, and adios.